So today is going to be part two of the delicate dance, Halacha and human nature, which deals with the tension between, on the one hand, the demands made upon us by living in accordance with the Torah, and on the other hand, the fact that we're human beings and we have impulses and drives which are not always harmonious with the demands of the Torah. How does one navigate that particular tension? And just to do a quick review, last week I told you about a certain client that I had. Of course, I changed the names and the places, etc., so to preserve his anonymity. Where this particular client felt very bad because he was tempted to call up an old girlfriend in order to invite her over to give him a few minutes of respite from his anxiety and worries, etc. And he felt very bad. He actually didn't call her, but he felt very bad about it. He felt that what a horrible person he is, that he almost called up this girlfriend, and just by the grace of God.
I think last week you said he called her up.
No, he didn't. No, he didn't. If I wasn't clear, I apologize.
So he only thought of doing it.
He only thought of doing it. That's the exact point, as a matter of fact. So as I described, that the Tanya deals with that issue, and I had shared with this particular client what the Tanya says. And the Tanya says, just do a very brief review, that we sometimes can feel a tremendous amount of sadness and depression as a result of coping with these drives that we have as human beings. And the Baal Tanya says that that's a very unhealthy state to be in spiritually, because if you're in a state of depression or sadness, it's a low energy state, you're not going to be able to have the energy to be able to get yourself to do the things you should do as a Jew, and to prevent yourself from doing the things you shouldn't do as a Jew. And he says, not only that, but if you're wrestling with impulses, right, thoughts, right? This person had the thought of calling up this girlfriend. So rather than being upset, he actually should celebrate. He should be happy, be thrilled. Why should he be thrilled? So he explains that the Torah says, "Lo tadu acharei levavchem va'acharei einechem," that you shouldn't go after your heart and after your eyes that you lust after. And the Talmud explains that when you refrain from doing a prohibition, that you get the same credit as if you actually did a mitzvah. We don't usually think of it that way intuitively. Like, we don't think of, if someone cut us off on the road and we feel like killing them, and let's pretend for a second that we're armed. We could have killed them, right? But we don't, right? We don't pat ourselves on the back and say, well, that was really good, I didn't kill somebody today, right? But if you walk a blind person across the street, or you make $1 million donation to Or Torah Stone, so you feel good, you did a mitzvah, right? But the Talmud says that, in fact, when you refrain from doing a transgression, you get the same credit. You should feel the same kind of satisfaction. So the fact that this particular client didn't actually make the phone call, he didn't meet with her, so he fulfilled the mitzvah of lo tatu acharei levavchem. You shouldn't go after your heart and after your eyes. And he should give himself a pat on the back. And he says, furthermore, there's something ironic about being upset. And that is, it's based upon the premise that there's something wrong with you, that you had this impulse to call the girlfriend, right? So the Baal Tanya points out, who do you think that verse is addressed to? Don't follow your heart and your eyes. It's not addressed to an angel or some perfectly righteous person. It's addressed to a normal human being. We're built in a way that we have impulses.
Isn't also doing tshuva being confronted with the same temptation and learning to overcome it, like this fellow actually did by not calling?
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's another reason to give himself credit, that to say, wow, look, I've done tshuva, because maybe 6 months ago I would have made the phone call, but now I didn't. So wow, I'm making progress. That's a very good point. But just to continue with the thought, so the Baal Tanya points out that the verse is addressed to human beings who have these impulses. And that's our avodah. That's our job in this world, is to have these impulses. We're normal human beings, fleeting thoughts. and to not act upon them. And then he goes a little bit more mystical. And if you remember from last week, that he explains that God gets the greatest possible nachas. He's paraphrasing the Zohar. The greatest possible pleasure. Our Father in heaven, every father wants to get nachas from their children. The greatest possible nachas is from the when we refrain from doing a transgression, when we refrain from acting upon an impulse. Again, a little counterintuitive. You would think the greatest nachas God gets is from our positive actions, right? We made $1 million donation to charity, right? But it's not true. The greatest nachas that God gets is when we refrain from acting on an impulse. And then he quotes from the Zohar that says that, in fact, the mystical source of evil, sitra achra, the other side, term in the Zohar, is suppressed when we are able to suppress our internal yetzer hara, our internal negative impulse. And that's the greatest possible praise and the greatest possible elevation of God's name that there could be. So says the Tikkunei Zohar. So when we, as an individual, are able to exercise restraint, there's actually an effect upon the cosmos. The source of evil, the source of hiding God's presence in the world, is actually in some way reduced cosmically. It's mystical. Don't ask me to explain it, but it has this mystical effect. Okay, we're not individuals. Everything we do has this kind of impact on the cosmos. And he goes on, and just the last point in our review is that he says that he quotes this verse from Yitzchak talking to Esav. Isaac talking to Esav, and he says, "Go make me some matamim. Go to the field, make me some delicious food." And he quotes a mystical interpretation of that passage that is really the divine presence talking to Israel. The divine presence says to us, "I'm hungry." It's really sort of a crazy image. God says, "I'm hungry, make me some food." So how do we feed God? Well, you can feed God with matamim. That's the word used, plural, tasty dishes. Now, there are two types of tasty dishes. One is simple, a donut, sweet. Pour a bunch of sugar and flour together, simple and sweet, and that's tasty. But a more complex tasty food would be like the example we gave last week was skug, the Yemenite dynamite, made out of like jalapeno peppers, but cured in a way which makes them, I happen to like skug very much. Mix it with some hummus, and we're challah on Shabbat. Wow, I could have a whole meal out of that. So that's very complex, because if you would eat the jalapeno pepper alone, you might have to go to the emergency room, even though my children do it just to show off, to show their Yemenite side of their genes. I don't know where that comes from. But when you treat it in a special way, then it's actually more interesting and more exciting to eat than actually just a donut. So the Tanya makes this analogy that when you do a good deed, you give a $1 million donation to tzedakah, that's like a donut. Yeah, it's good, nice, very nice, God's happy. But when you take your own yetzer hara, right, the negative impulse, your internal jalapeno pepper, okay, and you treat it, that is, you use your just say no muscle, and you exercise refinement, and you restrain yourself, that's like skug, right? And God likes that even better. That's the matamim. That's the second type of tasty food, which gives God even greater nachas. Okay, so that's what we discovered last time. And just one more sentence. When my client heard this, that there's nothing to beat himself up over, the fact that he had an impulse to call her because he's a human being, it's to be expected. And on the contrary, he did exactly what he's supposed to do, and that is to exercise his just so no muscle. Don't follow through on the impulse. And it has all the salutary beneficial effects that exercising the just say no muscle has, both on a personal level, on a cosmic level, etc. Okay, now we'll take any kind of questions or comments, and then we're going to go on. Yes?
We have a propensity in Torah anyway, maybe throughout Tanakh. We take a story like Yosef's brothers selling him, and we turn it from being a problem into they were doing some type of a mitzvah. And Yosef even tells them, it was all part of God's plan. They looked at him, he was a rodef, they paskin, they put him in the pit, as opposed to, no, they did a terrible thing. So watch that tension that we're just not clear on the ethical message rather than convoluting it?
Yeah. Okay. So I would just say the following. That's an excellent question. It's a little bit out of the purview I want to discuss, so we'll save a frontal addressing of that for another time. But I'll just make one quick comment. I think the reason you're asking it is because it has sort of a similar theme to what we're talking about, and that is that in the client's eyes, what looks like transgression, we're really calling it's actually good. What happened? He had the thought, which is natural, and he didn't act on it. Exactly. So I'll just point out that the notion of that actually doing something sinful, like attempting to kill your brother or selling him into slavery, and then it turns out retroactively, or in retrospect, I should say, that it was a big mitzvah of sorts. Right? It turned out planting the seeds of the redemption of the Jewish people. So that's actually different because they actually did it. I'll just point out that I'll say two things, and I don't want to discuss it anymore after that. Number one, God has an incredible sense of humor. Number one. Number two, that whatever that story means, and it's profound and foundational, at the same time, it certainly doesn't give us license to do something prohibited based upon the assumption, well, I'm going to go murder somebody, but you know what? Because God has this crazy sense of humor, I'm sure that in a year from now, it's going to turn out I really did a mitzvah. So it's only after the fact that there's that kind of clarity. You're not allowed to behave before the fact in that way. And that actually was the root, among other things, of what happened with false messiahs, including Shabtai Tzvi, particularly, and Jacob Frank. This idea of, by doing something bad, it actually is good, etc. So we have to be extremely careful not to go overboard with that. Any other questions or comments before we move on?
Can I be heard? I'm not sure.
I'm sorry? I didn't hear. You know what, Danny? I think you need to. Last week also, your audio is messed up.
Yeah, my audio is still messed up.
Yeah, you need to do something about that because I would like to hear what you're saying, but I have no idea what you just said. Okay, all right. So let's go on now. Now you're going to see something. Today's going to be a little controversial. We're going to go on in that same chapter in Tanya. So if you take a look at the source sheet, on my source sheet, it's on page 2. The way they print sometimes a little bit different. And it's the last paragraph where it says, V'lo od ella. Okay, that's in the Hebrew text. And in the English text, it is the paragraph that says, moreover, even in the case of things that are fully permissible.
Rabbi Zeff,
okay,
can you hear me now?
Everybody have where we are? Dan, Danny, I can't still can't.
Yeah, can you hear me now? You should be able to hear me.
Oh, now I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm on my iPhone. I've given up my webcam.
Yeah. Okay, great.
I actually had this question. You're right, from last week, and
yeah. You know what, Danny? I think because you're on 2, it's echoing to your computer.
Okay, how's that now?
Yeah.
Is that better now?
You're perfect in many ways.
I wish my wife would say that. So I had this question from last week already. Sort of following Bruce's question, but not about the idea that the Torah somehow twists things or makes things convoluted. Just like the Pshat, we spend so many tefillot on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur talking about Hirurim Ra'im. And it seems like according to Tanya, there is no such concept because anything we're thinking bad of is natural.
Yeah, okay. It's an important question. So the Baal Tanya, he doesn't make that point here, but he makes it in other places. There's a distinction between Hirurim Rabim, which are spontaneous, fleeting thoughts, and then you have to figure out what to do with them, right? They kind of popped in your mind, an impulse. I'm going to call my girlfriend, my former girlfriend, right? And on the other hand, taking that thought and saying, I think I'm going to sit down here for the next 45 minutes and fantasize about what that would look like to call up this girlfriend. So it's those Hirurim Rabim, which we are responsible for because that's a conscious decision, right? I'm now going to pursue that thought purposefully, a purposeful decision. So those are the types of Hirurim in which we're responsible for, and we have to do tshuva about. He's dealing with impulses, right? The thought comes to your mind, right? And you become aware of that thought. And now what do? So you don't beat yourself up over it, right? So that's the distinction. Purposeful, here in Rabbi, versus an impulse. Okay, so let's now dig into that last paragraph in Tanya. Now, bear in mind that we are talking now, up to this point, about impulses to do something prohibited. So it could be, like the example I gave you, but it could be anything. Any kind of impulse, like killing the guy who cut you off on the road, or yelling at somebody that hurts their feelings, or lashon hora, whatever it may be, right? A million examples, okay? So now he goes on. Below od, not only what I said above, which was dealing with an impulse to do something prohibited, ela afilu b'devarim hamutarim legamre. Even if you have an impulse to do something which is 100% kosher, 100% kosher, like you want to eat breakfast, and glot kosher breakfast, no problem at all, right? Kol masha adam zoveach yitzro, to the extent that a person slaughters their impulse, yitzro, afilu sha'kala, even if it's just for a short period of time. Umitkavein la kafilas hitra achra, shebechalal smoli, and they do it with the intention of suppressing the forces of evil, which are associated with the left ventricle of the heart. Don't ask me what that means about the left ventricle of the heart, but they do it in order to suppress those material impulses, the impulses towards evil, even though, don't get confused, we're talking about eating glot kosher breakfast, 100% kosher, nothing wrong. Kagon, and he gives the example I just gave. Shachafes lechol, he wants to eat kosher. What should he do? He should delay the meal for an hour. You came home from shul, you want to eat breakfast, it's 9 o'clock in the morning, 8:30 in the morning, you say to yourself, I'm going to slaughter my yetzer. How? Even though I want to eat right now, I have that impulse, I'm going to delay it for an hour. Opachot, or even if it's for half an hour, doesn't have to be an hour. And instead, I'm going to learn Tanya during that time. So that's an example of what he's going to espouse. Not only the beneficial effect and praiseworthy effect of suppressing your negative impulses to do something prohibited, but this should become a spiritual discipline to suppress impulses that have nothing to do with anything negative, like eating breakfast. Kedit the Gemara, and he quotes the Gemara, which he explains is based upon the same principle. Gemara says the following: Shah Revi'it Machal Kol Adam, that the 4th hour into the day is when most people eat their first meal. Shah Shishit Machal Tamid Chacham, but the 6th hour, 2 hours later, that's when Torah scholars eat their meal. Now, what does that mean? What's this idea that normal people eat 4 hours into the day and Torah scholars eat 6 hours into the day? Why is that? They would delay, literally starve themselves for 2 extra hours, right? They would restrain themselves, Torah scholars, for 2 extra hours, l'chavanazo, because of this mystical reason. For this reason, to suppress the sitra achra, the other side, the impulse they have within them, even though it was an impulse to eat kosher breakfast, but to delay it for 2 hours in order for this intention, because it has all of this salutary effect of the giving nachas to God, right? Of schug, God's eating schug, right? Suppressing the cosmic source of evil in the world. Even though after the meal, they're also going to learn all day. Let me explain what he means by that. Because you might think what it means is they're not doing it for that mystical reason of suppressing the source of evil in the world by delayed gratification. No, you might think that the reason they're doing it is because they want to be able to do more learning. That's what he said, like that they'll be able to learn during those 2 hours. This is not true because these are people learning all day long anyway. So the fact that whether they have breakfast 4 hours into the day or 6 hours into the day, someone has their microphone on is creating a lot of static. So they learn all day long anyway, but it doesn't matter what time they eat. Again, someone's microphone. Whatever the time that they're eating breakfast is, it's not going to add to the number of hours they learn, right? Because, right, does everybody understand the math? It's not complicated, right? It's going to be some number of hours. So that can't be their intention. It has to be, their intention is mystical. That by suppressing their inner source of evil, the desire to eat a kosher breakfast, they're going to suppress the cosmic source of evil and give God this great nachas and spiritual uplift to elevate the glory of God in an unprecedented way. And then here's another example. So to another example, let's say that someone who puts the brakes, literally, bolem, like in modern Hebrew, blamim or brakes, right? Someone who puts the brakes on their mouth to not speak things that they want to speak, which deal with worldly things. We're not talking about lashon hara. We're not talking about gossip or anything like that. We're talking about the stock market or the World Series. What are you having for dinner? totally kosher, right? But you refrain from talking about it. It's the same thing. He says that would be a praiseworthy thing to do, to restrain yourself from talking, even though what you were going to talk about was perfectly fine. Okay, says the following. Why? Why should you do this? And then he quotes that passage from Tikkunei Zohar. Because when one exercises that self-restraint, even when it's totally kosher, that it suppresses, even a little bit, the sitra achra, the other side, right? That's an image for the source of evil in the world, which is inside oneself. And as a result of that, the glory of God is elevated. And then he goes on. And that kedusha, which is created as a result of that act of restraint, it actually pours down the sayo siyua ravatzum lavaroto yitbarach. There's like a feedback system. When you create that holiness in the cosmos as a result of exercising restraint, even things are totally permissible, that kedusha then comes down and it kind of empowers the person to become even more pious, even more holy, even more refined. V'zeh shamru razal, and this is the meaning of what our sages said when they said the following: Adam mekadesh atzmo mat lamata. If a person exercises sanctity, even a little bit down here in this world, in everyday mundane actions, which he's interpreting meaning totally permissible things, but exercising restraint anyway, mikachino to harbe lamala, that he's sanctified greatly from above. There's this cosmic holiness which will pour down from the heavens onto that person. In addition to the fact that he's actually fulfilling a mitzvah from the Torah, according to the Balatanya, v'hi kadishtem, that you should sanctify yourselves and you should be holy, the Torah says. What does it mean you sanctify yourselves and be holy? So the Balatanya explains, it means the following: when a person sanctifies himself in the realm of what's permissible, totally kosher, that you should make yourselves holy, you should make yourselves holy, right? By exercising your restraint. Even though you're exercising restraint, even though you do have the impulses, but you exercise restraint for permissible things. You still have Yetzer Hara, which is in its strength and in its energy in the left ventricle of your heart, just as it was yesterday. But you're just exercising restraint in order to suppress the your Yetzer Hara, and you're sanctifying yourself in that sense. What will be the result? The Torah says, then you'll really be holy. How so? Because they'll become this holy energy which comes from above, pouring down from the upper spheres, which will pour into your soul and make you really holy. You'll actually have less of a Yetzer Hara. as a result of exercising restraint to suppress the Yetzer Hara, there'll be this kind of feedback effect in which the Yetzer Hara will be less. And from heaven, you'll receive assistance to be able to expel one's Yetzer Hara little by little. Okay, that's the Balatanya. So let's just do a quick review of what he just said. I want you to appreciate this. He's suggesting that the same spiritual mystical dynamics which occur when we're able to suppress an impulse to do something forbidden are there when we exercise restraint in the realm of the permitted. Permitted 100%. Glot kosher food. Nothing, no trace of anything forbidden there. But it has the same mystical effect of, by suppressing an impulse internally, it's able to suppress the cosmic source of evil in the world. You get showered upon you this force of holiness as a result of your attempts at being holy. And you actually are able, little by little, to actually change internally the effect of your personal impulses upon you. So says the Balatanya. Okay, let's pause here. And I want to make sure that everybody understands what we just said. If you have any questions or comments on this. In other words, he's essentially espousing what we call asceticism, right? To exercise restraint for its own sake, right? In the realm of the permissible. I just want to point out as an observation, there's a famous Ramban, Nachmanides, on the same verse that says, Kadoshim to you should be holy. So the Ramban uses the same language, but he doesn't mean the same thing. I just want everybody to appreciate that with all due humility. You might think that he's citing the Ramban here. The Ramban says the following. What does it mean to be holy? So the Ramban, Nachmanides, says it means to do those things which are not technically permitted, forbidden, not technically forbidden, but are not good. I mean, he's very explicit about this. He's not talking about the Ramban, having glot kosher breakfast with, not overdoing it, half a bagel, low-fat cream cheese, only one shot of whiskey instead of 3. Right? Like, we're not talking about overdoing it, right? I may have confused you by what I just said. The Ramban is talking about when you overdo it, like being a glutton. Kadoshim to you, according to Nachmanides, means don't be a glutton. There's no passage in the Torah that says don't overeat. At least hard to identify such a passage. So you're technically allowed to overeat, but it's bad for you. So there's a prohibition called be holy. That's to tell you that even though something may be technically permitted, if it's something which obviously is not good for the world, don't do that too. That's called be holy. That's different than what the Balatanya is saying. The Balatanya is saying, even in the realm of there's no hint of anything inappropriate about what you're about to do, and you want to do it, like eat breakfast in normal amounts and not, not overdoing and not gluttony. Exercise restraint there too, because of this mystical idea of suppressing the internal Yetzer Hara, which will suppress the cosmic source of Yetzer Hara. Okay, let's just pause here for a moment and open up to any questions or comments.
Isn't that idea of refraining, not from gluttony, like you said, but just from normal daily activities, isn't that an anti-Jewish idea?
Meaning we have an extra soul in Shabbat to actually eat more as opposed to eating less.
Yeah, I'm enjoying your question because it's sort of, there's something humorous about it. I'll explain what I mean. How do we know what's Jewish? So there are certain sources we look to determine, we consider them authoritative. And by looking at these sources, we can try to define the realm of what's Jewish, the spectrum, right? I would say, generally speaking, the Tanya is considered to be a very authoritative work. Even people who aren't so crazy about Chassidut learn Tanya. Rav Soloveitchik famously learned Tanya. Rabbi Norman Lamb, who just died recently, the former president of Yeshiva University, wrote a whole book about Tanya and comparing it to the Nefesh HaChaim, the great work by the chief disciple of the Vilna Gaon. So, so here we have somebody who's an authoritative interpreter of Judaism, who is saying that it's Jewish, right? So,
well, where are the limits of this? My daughter, unfortunately, just spent a week in some Buddhist monastery in Thailand, where they woke them up at 4 or 4:30 in the morning to meditate for 3 hours, and they slept on wooden beds with no mattress, and you were not allowed to eat after 12:30 noon time until the next morning every day for a week.
Right.
That to me is, I think Rambam talks about sagfanut. I think that's the word he uses.
Right.
That we don't believe it.
Torture yourself. Right.
Yeah.
So asceticism. Right. So I think that generally speaking, you might even be surprised at this passage in Tanya, because Chassidut is not generally associated with these kinds of practices. It's more whether rightfully or not, it's associated with like the Musar movement, like rolling in the snow and doing things that are painful because it's good for your soul, right? So I think that's a very good question, and I would say the following: even the Balatanya would say that everything in moderation. So now I can't define it; it's because there's no objective definition of when you cross the threshold from self-deprivation, which is good for you, and self-deprivation, which is neurotic and ultimately going to be destructive. I mean, unfortunately, there are people who die of anorexia nervosa. They starve themselves to death. That's neurotic. I don't want to label it as pathological. It's extremely dangerous. So it has to be done with moderation, and each case is different. So you'd have to consult with your local Chabad rabbi. Is this level of self-deprivation going to be healthy for me, or is that already going over the board to being, punishing myself in a way that is not healthy?
Is your sense from this passage in the Tanya then that the Bala Tanya would be in favor of people, let's say, fasted once or twice a week?
Yeah. So the answer would be, I don't think you make a blanket rule. It would be dependent upon the person. There may be people who we would say that's very appropriate, and the people who would say that that's inappropriate, and it's not going to be healthy for you. So I can only come away with a general principle here. The application would be very individualized.
Why don't we say the same thing on the Ramban's comment? That those who hold back, well, it depends who they are. It's not a general Jewish principle.
No, because the Ramban, that's what I was trying to make. I probably wasn't clear on that. The Ramban is saying when you hold back from something which is objectively gluttony, right? So that I don't think is so mystical. I think we all know when, my wife sometimes says to me, it doesn't really help much, it just makes me feel bad, when I ask for the third piece of whatever, right? And she says, "Are you hungry?" And I like, "No." Well, then why do you want it? So, because that's called gluttony. So, that's actually can be defined probably, that each person knows themselves. Okay. Ready for this? Any other comments or questions before we now see something that, whoa, there's a problem here. So any other comments or questions before we go on? Okay, get ready for this. Everything we said to now, I want you to press the save button put it into your hard drive, but I want you to sort of clear the slate now. Okay, so don't delete anything we said, but just put it aside. So now I want to turn to where there's a Gemara quoted on my text. It's page 5. It's a Gemara in Masechet Shabbat. Let's learn the Gemara. It starts with a Mishnah. Lo yeshev adam lifnei sapar samuch lemincha ad sheyipalel. A person shouldn't sit in the barber shop adjacent to mincha until he's davened. So it's the afternoon, getting late. You want to get a haircut. The halacha is daven mincha first and then get a haircut. Why? We're afraid that if you'll sit down to get a haircut before you daven, that you'll start enjoying yourself. You'll tell the barber all your problems in life, how your wife, every time you want to have a second piece of something, she says you're hungry, she's making you miserable. So, and then you'll end up forgetting about davening mincha. Okay. And for the same reason, it describes other situations. Lo yiknes adam lemerchatz. You shouldn't go into the bathhouse, right? Again, late in the afternoon, you'll get distracted. You'll forget to daven mincha. Lo laborski, lo lechov, lo ladim. Okay, different situations. The tannery, eating, going to a beit din, etc. All things that may distract you, and you'll end up forgetting to daven mincha. But then the Mishnah itself says, "V'mitchilu." But what if you started your haircut? You forgot the halacha, right? It's late in the afternoon. You walked into the barber shop, and you start getting a haircut, and then all of a sudden, you remember, oh, there's a halacha. I was still to daven mincha first before I get the haircut. So if you started the haircut already, the halacha is just continue, and but try to finish in time. You'll be able to daven mincha. Okay, everybody got it? So that these famous terms, and we see this distinction a lot of times in the Talmud of lechatchila and b'diavad or b'diavad, we say in yeshivas, right? Before the fact and after the fact. So before the fact, right? Don't go into the barber shop until you daven mincha. After the fact, you already did. You already started the haircut. So we allow you to continue with the haircut and just make sure you end in time. Yes?
Yeah, but if like you forgot to take lulav and you sat down to eat a meal in the sukkah, you're supposed to stop in the middle of the meal, take the lulav, make your bracha, and then you can continue your meal. So I'm a little confused here.
Yeah. Okay. So that's an interesting question. I don't want to address it right now because it sort of gets, I don't want to explore so much that that principle in the Talmud, even though it's a very good question. Rabbi Grunstein would be delighted to address that. So we can discuss the halachas of sukkah.
It seems really just like derech eretz. It doesn't seem that complicated. I mean, derech eretz would dictate that you prioritize appropriately.
Yeah. Okay.
So if
I mean, this is not meant to be complicated.
No.
Okay. This is not the shocking part. We're going to get there. So now the Gemara on that Mishnah wants to explain the last phrase, because the last phrase in the Mishnah says, but if you began the haircut, so you can continue. And just make sure you end in time to daven mincha. So the Gemara asks, Umeatai hatkalat tisporet. So how do we find you began your haircut? In order that law would kick in, that you don't have to stop. You can go ahead and finish the haircut and daven mincha later. So Amar Rabbi Avin, Mishianiach ma'aforet shel saparim al birkav. From the time that the barber places the apron on your knees. So if you walked into the barber shop, so let's say you're walking up to the barber shop and you didn't enter yet, even if you entered, and then you realize, oh, there's a halacha, I'm supposed to daven mincha first. So the halacha is leave, daven mincha, and come back. Scenario number 2, you come in, you sit down in the barber chair, the barber puts the apron on you, and then, oi, I just remembered a halacha I learned this morning in Daf Yomi. I'm supposed to daven mincha first. Now the halacha is, that's already called the beginning of the haircut, even though he hasn't snipped your hair. Just the apron. That's interesting. Like, why not define haircut as haircut? So once they start to cut your hair, so then you can finish the haircut and daven mincha later. But that's not the halacha. The halacha is merely putting the apron on is considered beginning of the haircut, and you don't have to leave. Finish the haircut and daven mincha later. So Rav Kook wrote a commentary. We don't have much of it. It's called Ein Ayah, which is a commentary on the Agadah in the Talmud. Now, it's interesting. Whenever you look at a passage in the Talmud and you want to ask yourself, is this a halacha, a law, or is it Agadah, a non-legal passage? It's not always clear what's a halacha, what's an Agadah. I mean, at first glance, I would say we just learned a halacha. It certainly sounds like it. But for some reason, Rav Kook, in his commentary in the Agadah, comments on this. Now, let's see what he has to say. It's a little complicated. So we're going to skip. Now we're in Rav Kook, source number 4. We're going to skip. He quotes the Talmud. We already read the Talmud. We don't have to read that. We're going to start with Kol Divrei Chachamim. Kol Divrei Chachamim shasu siyag v'Torah. All the matters of the sages in which they made a protective fence on the Torah. Right? This is a protective fence, right? We're talking about don't do this, lest it come to that. Right? Make sure you don't start a haircut, right? Lest you forget to daven mincha. It's a siyag, a protective fence. Those protective fences are shkulim b'shekel hakodesh. They are weighed with the holy shekel. You know, a shekel is a coin, but the word shekel also means to weigh. It means to weigh. So he says that when they made these enactments, they weighed them with very careful, holy criteria. The sages were very careful how they created their prohibitions, their protective fences. She'alehem ein lo sif, and one should not add to the rabbinic prohibitions. Rabbinic prohibition means the Talmudic prohibitions. It doesn't mean some rabbi in Efrat who had a dream and he invented a new prohibition based upon a dream. We're talking about the Talmudic sages enacting these rabbinic fences. They're very carefully calibrated, that's what Rav Kook said, and therefore one shouldn't add to them, and kamo shemehem ein ligroa, and not subtract. Don't tamper with it, because it's very carefully calibrated. Now he goes on. Ukasher ha-chokhmah ha-elokit shi'ara. Just like the divine wisdom calculated, eich lamid et kol tzadei chaim al mechonam, how to establish all of life on a firm footing, levilti hichid tapulot musariot haniskavot, so that one does not diminish ethical, lofty actions by the lack of their impact upon deeds. Now, I know that didn't mean anything. So let me just explain what he just said. He said that when God made decrees, they're not rabbinic decrees, right? The provisions of the Torah. God had to balance two things. This is extremely important. He wanted to establish life in a healthy way. We live life. Life. That means eating, drinking, sleeping, right? Life. Business, life. In a way that reflects ethics. Now, when you live life, according to God, you engage the real material world, but it should reflect ethical and spiritual values. So that means there are going to be demands made upon us by the Torah, by God, that force us to exercise restraint and deliberateness that will, in certain ways, impinge upon our embracing all of life just flowing. No. Because we want ethics and spiritual values to have their imprint upon life. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, not to overly weigh upon material life. Meaning, God says, look, I want people to live life. I want people to be able to be part of this world. On the one hand, that means people should live life. They should work, procreate, eat, drink, and be merry, and etc. I want that. On the other hand, there are certain spiritual and values which I want to be expressed in that life. So God had to maneuver between these two goals of living natural life on the one hand and expressing spiritual moral values on the other. So whenever the Torah says don't do something, it's perfectly calculated and calibrated a balance between naturalness on the one hand and expressing through self-restraint and deliberateness ethical spiritual values. Is that pretty clear? Okay. And then he references the Moreh Nevuchim that the Rambam, he claims, says the same thing. So we're skipping just a few words. Chen he'erichu chachamim. So too the sages, when they made their prohibitions, rabbinic prohibitions, these fences, they used God as the paradigm. Just like God had to navigate between these two considerations. Natural life, good. At the same time, ethics and spirituality, also good. So we're going to ask people to exercise restraint, but in a very calibrated way, so we don't kill the naturalness of life, on the one hand, but we don't kill off spiritual and ethical values, on the other hand. That balance. So the sages use the same kind of approach. So too the sages estimated according to this type of criteria. Et tochen divrehem, the contents of what they wanted to do, when they wanted to make offense upon the Torah. When they saw that just a very minor fence, a minor rabbinic prohibition would suffice, they would not make the rabbinic prohibition any more severe. To not overly weigh upon the natural inclinations of a person and to move it away from your natural desire. So the sages also had to carefully calibrate their prohibitions so that they don't err on either side. It's not overly demanding, which would crush your natural self, your chayfetz, your desires, your ratzon, your will. And on the other hand, to make sure that they enact these prohibitions which are necessary in order to live a life of that reflects these spiritual and ethical values. Al kain ba'asher matzu lefi midat ha'erach shel isur ha'hitaskut lifnei tfiyat hamincha b'divrei sheyuchal ligrom labitul daibos from isur lechatchila shelo latfil. That's why he says our example of the haircut is the perfect example. So they said, okay, we want to make sure you daven mincha. That's important spiritual value. We want to make sure you don't miss it. So we're going to prohibit before the fact going into the barber without davening. But if you began, they said, we don't want to stand in the way of your natural desire and will to finish getting the haircut. Because that would be overly suppressing of your natural instincts and desires. It would go overboard. So that's the delicate balance of, on the one hand, we want to make sure you daven mincha. On the other hand, we don't want to make you crazy, right? Where you have to suppress your natural inclinations, which is, I want to get the haircut and I'm sitting here already. Okay.
Isn't that just another way of talking about takana she'en hatzibur yachol la'amod bo?
Okay, so let me just finish, okay? I don't want, because we're running out of time, I just want to finish this. I'll get to your question. So he then goes on. Now, remember that in the halacha that we're talking about now, how is beginning the haircut defined? It's pretty crazy. Not getting your haircut. It was actually just having the apron put on you. Why were they so lenient about that? That's already considered to be after the fact and you can finish the haircut, even though it didn't start snipping. So he says, I'm just skipping a few words, that the sages were able to really understand human inclinations. It's human nature, human psychology, that once you turned away from whatever you're doing, like I was working in front of the computer, and now I want to go get my haircut. So in my mind, okay, I'm not working anymore. I'm going to get a haircut, right? And I'm in the haircut mode, right? It's actually hard psychologically to say, well, I'm really excited about getting a haircut, and I'm sitting in the barber chair. Oi, I just remember this halacha, I got to go daven. That's actually not so easy to uproot yourself from that sort of psychological mode you're now in of the haircut mode. Even though you didn't begin the haircut, just the mere hachana, the mere preparation. You're already in the mode of haircut, even with the apron on. And therefore, the sages didn't want to be overly demanding that you repress and suppress the natural desire to now get your haircut. You're in that mode of wanting to get your haircut, right? You're there with the apron on. That's why they came to the decision that if you began, you don't have to stop. It's not limited to, in fact, the final getting your haircut, but even getting the apron on you. And each case would have to be judged, each halachic case, judged, and that he's basically addressing your question, Arthur, about the lulav, right? Each circumstance has to be judged based upon the uniqueness of that particular mitzvah, the context, etc. When the sages, who are amazing psychologists, determined that now you're totally engaged, and to ask you to disengage is too much of a suppression and repression of your natural instincts, which is not good. Now watch this last sentence here, and you should underline this. It's appropriate to honor the natural instincts of a human being. It's appropriate to honor the natural instincts of a human being. Unless it's in a situation where there's an ethical necessity to suppress your natural instincts. The only time you should suppress your natural instincts, which should be honored, is if there is an overwhelming ethical, spiritual consideration which forces you to suppress that natural instinct. And in the case of mincha, right, the calculation was that once you have the apron on, that it would be too much to ask of a person to uproot themselves from their natural instinct in order to make sure they daven mincha. We just hope you go ahead and finish the haircut. We're going to respect your nitya hativit, your natural instincts, and we will hope that there'll be time enough to daven mincha. This is amazing. Now, I just want to make a couple of comments and then open up for questions and comments. Let's now press the retrieve button from our hard drive from the Balatanya. Has anybody noticed how this, at first glance, and maybe at second and third glance too, seems to be totally the opposite of the Balatanya? The Balatanya had said that there is great mystical significance to exercising restraint in general, when there's no compelling ethical or spiritual consideration, right? We're not talking about missing mincha or anything like that, that you should delay eating breakfast, even though it's only half a bagel and low-fat cream cheese and only one shot of whiskey, right? Nothing gluttonous about it at all. Just in order to suppress the yetzer, that need, that natural need, the natural want to eat, right? But to eat in a moderate way, suppress it because of the cosmic impact of the suppression. Whereas the Balatanya says that we have to honor those natural instincts. And we're only going to suppress those natural instincts, right? If there's an overwhelming, compelling, ethical, spiritual value at stake, right? Like missing mincha. In this case, even being very lenient about that, like that if you only have the apron on, we're going to let you continue, right? But the sages were reluctant to impose limitations on the natural instinct because they felt, according to Rav Kook, that one has to honor the natural self. It's there to be honored, and we're going to be very circumspect upon demanding limitations and restraint on the natural instinct unless there are very, very compelling reasons. Wow, it's like a different religion. So two very different models about navigating the relationship between the demands of Jewish tradition on the one hand and our natural selves on the other. We have much more to talk about, which we'll do next week in terms of trying to explore deeper what Rav Kook is talking about and try to define more what may be the point of dispute between the two of them on some kind of mystical, psychological, spiritual level, which we'll try to do next week. And we have 2 minutes to open up for any comments or questions on what we've done so far.
We have Danny's question.
Well,
yeah. So go ahead.
I remember my late uncle sitting down at the El Gaucho restaurant in 1991 or 2 during the Gulf War and announcing that if they served his 300-gram steak, even if there was a siren and they had to vacate the restaurant and go into the kitchen in the back, he wasn't going to get up once they'd put the meat on the table. So that's the equivalent of the apron in the barber shop, because the Chachamim or the Torah is obviously clever enough to understand our Yetzer and not to impose things that we're not going to be able to handle.
See, okay, so here's the thing. Rav Kook is not saying we're not able to handle it. You could do it, but he thinks it will have a damaging impact. Now, next week, I'm going to explain what the damaging impact is.
Isn't that the same? Isn't that the other side of the same coin?
Perhaps. I mean, when you say not being able to handle it, that's sort of a very dramatic phrase. Because I think Rav Kook would say you could do it, but it's not good for you. The question is, why not? So that'll be discussed next week. Yeah, Arthur.
Yeah, I disagree with Rav Kook and Baltanya and the Gemara, in essence, when analyzing this.
You just lost your place in the world to come. Go on.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll burn a little longer. Basically, I think what the Mishnah is telling us is that your mincha is less important than the mitzvah of Ben Adam L'Chaveiro, because the barber's time is more important than your mincha.
Yeah, interesting. So that would be another pshat interesting pshat. You make that up right now?
Yeah, it just occurred to me.
Yeah, so it's a very different pshat, obviously. And
because the barber's time, the attendant in the bath, and the tanner, their time is more important than your mincha.
Yeah. Okay. So obviously, Rav Kook interprets that Gemara differently than you, but I hear exactly what you're saying. It's very interesting shot there, and we'll just have to leave it as a dispute between you and the rest of the world. And
okay.
and
Won't be the first.
we look forward to Rav Chaim's shiur. Take care, everybody. See you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Zeff. Arthur,